Thank you for joining me. I'm Gord Long. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They are commentary for educational and discussion purposes only. Always consult a professional financial advisor before making any investment decisions. China appears to be lapsing into its most significant economic slowdown, not driven by pandemic disease in a generation. There's plenty to worry about in China, which includes Xi Jinping's leadership becoming distinctively authoritarian with shocking clampdowns on the private sector. Nervous Western investors is not going to help China's investment-led economy. China has slowing economic growth, the credit overhang and potential for crisis in real estate thanks to the stricken China developer, the Evergrande Group, China's problematic relationship with the West and the potential for another Cold War, trade and the risk of deeper protectionism, and as I mentioned, the alarming leadership shift of Xi Jinping. However, I want to go right to the central problem in China as I see it. That is an investment-led investment model, which was allowed to get out of control and now threatens China falling from its perch, much as Japan did when it spiraled into a multi-decade deflationary spiral, the commonality being a massive real estate bubble that imploded. As such, I like to discuss the items outlined here. We last discussed China in the spring when we talked about COVID triggering the next great financial crisis. A big part of that was about rising costs and razor-thin margins in China. Inflation has only gotten worse, along with severe power shortages and COVID reaping more damage, with forced factory shutdowns further aggravating margins and placing pressure on increasing their export prices. Added to shipping, U.S. port, and delivery price increases, we are seeing the elevated prices in U.S. import costs we warned of. Rising consumer prices in a 70% consumption economy like the U.S., while experiencing shrinking real disposable income, is a recipe for a global demand shock at some point. Today, the situation in China has advanced, where further problems are clearly evident, which will lead to China taking the world towards a period of stagflation, or what we have been referring to here at MetaSii.com as the Great Stagflation. What we hope to leave you with in this session is the understanding that China's structural problems associated with its national investment-centric model, its regional and city dependency on property, and the dominance of real estate wealth to the Chinese public has become a self-reinforcing, culturally driven feedback loop that has resulted in a potentially serious global systemic problem. This loop has massive implications on the Chinese credit impulse, which since the 2008 financial crisis has been a major driver of global economic activity and certainly was central in lifting the world out of the 2008 financial crisis and most bumps in the road ever since, a situation that will further aggravate global supply and demand shocks, which we recently discussed in our latest macro analytics video with Charles U. Smith entitled Grab a Life Vest, 4 Tsunami Waves Are About to Hit at Once. All of this must now be considered in the context of a major shift in direction by China's leader Xi Jinping, which is potentially and rapidly turning China from a global competitor into a global security threat. Let's start with China's dependence on its investment model as opposed to the U.S.'s consumption model. Both are fine if not taken to extremes. Unfortunately, in both cases, they have been. The rise in Chinese GDP since its entry into the World Trade Organization in 2002 has been nothing short of astounding. It is hard to imagine on the surface a bigger success story in such a short period of time, especially if you consider it took its 1.4 billion population along the way without a major economic or social crisis. Today, based on purchase price parity, China rivals the U.S. as the global economic leader. However, as I said, China's dramatic growth has been a result of growth in investment fixed capital as shown on the right, as compared to household consumption in the U.S. as shown on the left. China's massive export growth in becoming the global factory is no doubt important, but it is the capital investment which it initially attracted to China as a result of over 60,000 factories, leaving the U.S. in a historic offshoring push to capture labor arbitrage was the real catalyst of its GDP growth. Imports and exports with such small margins have frankly been more about employing 1.4 billion people and keeping the social fabric together with improving standards of living. It is the I for investment in the GDP formula, not the C for consumption as in the U.S., remembering that the G for government in the U.S. is the driver of transfer payments and entitlements that are now underpinning U.S. consumption, and that fiscal debt underpins foreign investment, or the I, in the U.S. This chart of percentage contribution of GDP growth in China illustrates how important gross capital formation, in yellow, is to China. It compares to net exports of goods and services, shown in gray. Final consumption expenditure in blue is now important, but nothing compared to the U.S. in its importance. What is now driving capital formation in China today is real estate. Over 70% of China's wealth is now held in real estate. The industry now accounts for about a third of gross domestic output and 40% of household assets. China is about property development, regional infrastructure investment, and housing. So how could that be a problem? Well, that starts with understanding who owns the land and the fact that there are no property taxes in China to fund local and city infrastructure as there are in the developed world. I thought Jim Chanos, a renowned short seller, truly understands China when he said, and I quote, "When you have an investment-driven economic model, you know your annual GDP on January the 1st of that year because you can stick shovels in the ground to make your growth numbers. That's how the model works," end of quote. That is exactly what is going on with China's economic reporting. Why would you quite literally build massive numbers of ghost cities? And I encourage you to do a Google search and see the magnitude of what you will discover here. China has and continues to build massive public transportation projects and endless other public works that are unfunded and significantly underutilized just on speculation without recurring revenue streams to support the investment. This would be unheard of in any country other than China and would lead quickly to spectacular bankruptcy, but not in China. Why? With no property taxes to support local and city infrastructure, where does the money come from, and how does it pay the required ongoing support and maintenance services required for all these developments and infrastructure investments? The money comes primarily from three sources. First, the sale of land to developers. The government owns all the land and sells it as a dominant source of capital formation. Presto, you have capital formation. Secondly, official debt from government-controlled banks and lending. Thirdly, hidden debt from various special purpose entities, LICs and LGFVs. We'll get to those in a moment. The same sort of entities that we are familiar with after the dot-com bubble implosion and the financial scandals such as Enron. Direct borrowing by local governments is mostly restricted in China. In order to circumvent these restrictions, local governments have turned to affiliated organizations, such as local investment companies, the LICs, and to take on debt and finance projects. The result has been that local debts has become incredibly complex and difficult to track, and hidden. Since everything in China is opaque, no one really knows what is going on, maybe, and hopefully, other than the Chinese Communist Party or the CCP. An S&P Global Ratings report on October the 16th shed light on this nationwide issue, stating that off-balance sheet debt in local governments could be as high as $4.5 trillion, mostly in the form of local government financing vehicles, or the LGFVs. Separately, a S&P credit analyst is bravely on the record recently, leaking, and I quote, "The potential amount of debt is an iceberg with titanic credit risks," unquote. This is where it begins, but this is actually just the tip of a very large iceberg. This is because the real estate industry in China accounts for a third of GDP, but 40% of all household assets, as I mentioned earlier, and over 70% of China's wealth. The Chinese Wealth Management Products, or WMPs, is the greatest Ponzi scheme in the history of the world, in my assessment. Chinese retail investors are led to believe that WMPs are like bank deposits and are backed by the bank. that sells them. They are not, but that's not understood properly. They're actually unsecured units in blind pools that can be invested in anything the pool manager wants. Most WMP funds have been invested in the real estate sector. This has led to asset bubbles in real estate at best and wasted developments that cannot cover their costs at worst. When investors want their money back, the sponsor simply sells more WMPs and uses the money to pay back the redeeming investors. This is exactly the definition of a Ponzi scheme. The total amount invested in WMPs is now in the trillions of dollars, used to finance thousands of projects sponsored by hundreds of major developers. Chinese investors are all in with WMPs. Now the entire edifice is fracturing and beginning to crumble. The largest property developer in China, Evergrande, is quickly headed for bankruptcy. That's a multi-billion-dollar fiasco on its own. The Evergrande losses will also rise in WMPs, corporate debt, unpaid contractor bills, equity markets, and unfinished housing projects endlessly out there. China's entire property and financial system is potentially on the verge of a world historic crackup, and it won't remain limited to China. Understand two facts. Unlike buying a house in the U.S. where you put some money down and the bulk when you close and move in China you put all your money into an WMP or housing investment and nothing has been built. All your money is upfront. Many Chinese buyers have now bought upwards of 8 housing units on speculation with their pyramiding supposed already earned profits. The leverage in reverse of falling property values will make the Bear Stearns and Lehman mortgage debacle of 2008 look like small potatoes. China has tried 3 previous times over the last 10 years to slow this bubble. They're not unaware of this at all, but have failed. It is trying again, but so far has ended up with the Evergrande debacle. China's GDP is currently being dramatically taken down as its GDP from housing plummets as shown in red. This is a bubble that has been pricked. The CCP has the money and the power to put patches on it, but how effectively they will be and how long they will last, that's the question. Remember, China's investment-led model is built on real estate, and they can't keep a lid on it very long without severe consequences to growth. The CCP and China's leader, Xi Jinping, are acutely aware of all of this. I can't help but wonder if this is a source of his recent rapid and what appears to be accelerated shift in direction. In the way of background, Xi Jinping in 2013 was initially seen as just the latest in a series of technocrats. He would follow along with Deng's reforms. It is capitalism with Chinese characteristics. It's okay to get rich as long as the country prospers. Xi's first speech in China after becoming president, he was very critical of the Soviet Union for being soft in perestroika. They should have crushed it when they had the chance, he's quoted as saying. Xi then set up an institute to study the Soviet Union's collapse to properly understand it. That was a red flag that he was going to be more hardline than people thought. He then went on to do an anti-corruption drive. He used the anti-corruption purge to sideline political rivals. People were dismissed as a typical settling of scores that Chinese leaders do. He cemented China as the regional superpower. He punished more than 1 million party members, which helped his popularity among the rest. He clamped down on many emerging freedoms, increasing its state surveillance and censorship programs. A couple of years later, he began talking in puritanical terms about social issues. Nobody had cared about that stuff for 20 years. The message was, do what you want as long as you don't question the party. He then issued a book collecting his speeches and writings. People could be seen carrying it around like mayos. He started showing up in military events, even dressed in mail jackets. This sort of symbolism isn't lost in China. In 2008, China allowed him to remain president for life as the 2-term limits were removed. He immediately consolidated his political power as the party voted to enshrine his name and political ideology in the party's constitution, elevating his status to the level of its founder, Chairman Mao. The real switch then occurred in 2019. He then started going after celebrities like Jack Ma, co-founder of Alibaba. He was taking a much harder line on the flowers of capitalism, if you will, than anyone had done previously. His thought is the ideologically approved document by the Communist Party, which was issued last October. It's officially called Xi Jinping's Thought on Socialism with Chinese Characteristics for the New Era. His new thought on socialism, all of this exploded into the open. There's been initiative after initiative, redistribution of wealth to the masses, going after other leaders. Overlaid on top of this is the Evergrande. George Soros, the elitist voice for globalism, suddenly spoke out strongly in UK's Financial Times and the US Wall Street Journal's editorial section. You must remember, they're the paper of record for the Davos global elite. And I quote, he said, Xi believes Mao invented a superior form of organization, which he is carrying on, a totalitarian closed society in which the individual is subordinated to the one-party state. It is superior in this view because it is more disciplined, stronger, and therefore bound to prevail in a contest. End of quote. Another Z quote, and I quote Soros again here. Relations between China and the U.S. are rapidly deteriorating and may lead to war. Xi has made clear that he intends to take possession of Taiwan within the next decade, and he is increasing China's military capacity accordingly. End of quote. Another quote, I consider Xi the most dangerous enemy of open societies in the world. The Chinese people as a whole are among his victims, but domestic political opponents and religious and ethnic minorities suffer from his prosecution much more. End of quote. These are pretty damning words and a clear message. The message is it's time to reconsider your capital being invested in or held by China if you expect to get it back. Xi Jinping knows his power is at its greatest, and the investment-led model must change. But getting from here to there is a big step, a step that will cost him and his party power if not handled boldly and on a large enough scale. China's annualized two-year change for both retail sales and industrial productions have been on a steady decline for nearly 10 years now. Its struggle with managing credit growth has resulted in a steadily overall slowing year-over-year credit growth. The Chinese credit impulse is telling us that the world will soon feel the impact of China's restrictive credit policies. We lag by about 12 months, even without the potential fallout from a real estate sector letting out air, which will make this impulse even worse, much worse. The question is, what is likely ahead and what it will mean for investors? So far, the world is expressing its concerns through its investment decisions. Chinese ADRs have fallen massively out of favor, at least in the U.S. Stocks with the greatest Chinese exposures have also fallen badly so far this year, while U.S. and other country stocks reach historic levels while also mounting a post-pandemic recovery. Shanghai shares have fallen relative to the S&P. The red annotations show this is based on Chinese policy decisions, lowered its GDP outlook, and warned of an asset bubble. The crackdown on technology and education sectors, the video gaming ban, emphasis on common prosperity, the Macau crackdown, all led to this trend. I think this chart, reflecting how the Chinese credit impulse leads commodity futures, tells us a lot about what is ahead. The good news is inflation pressures from materials may tame. The bad news is that's all the good news. Everything else portends badly for both China and the rest of the world. The credit and liquidity engine for the world has more than a serious sniffle. Even a sniffle, however, usually means a cold or worse for the rest of the world. Beware and be cautious. As I always remind you in these videos, remember politicians and central banks will print the money to solve any and all problems until such time as no one will take the money or it is of no value. That day is still in the future, so take advantage of the opportunities that currently exist. Investing is always easier when you know with relative certainty how the powers to be will react. Your chances of success go up dramatically. The powers to be are now effectively trapped by policies of fiat currencies, unsound money, political polarization, and global policy paralysis. It doesn't mean they can't kick the can down the road with surprisingly new changes in policies or regulations. I'd like to take a moment as a reminder, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for education and discussion purposes only. As negative as these comments often are, there has seldom been a better time for investing. However, it requires careful analysis and not following what have traditionally been the true and tried approaches. Do your reading and make sure you have a knowledgeable and well-informed financial advisor. So until we talk again, may 2021 turn out to be an outstanding investment year for you and your family. And I sincerely thank you for listening.